what are we going to do about the housing crisis? This is not just a recent problem. This has been in the making for decades, and it is down to bad housing management, no long-term strategy, in fact, no strategy whatsoever. And despite the fact that the major parties blame each other, they have both had significant periods in government and they haven't solved the problem. But what is causing it? What is exacerbating the problem? And what can be done about it? And who's to blame? Well, first of all, this video is about addressing the housing crisis and building a future for the nation. Here's a few housing statistics before we get going. The government estimates that 300,000 new homes are needed per year. Not sure how accurate that is, considering that last year alone 1.4 million people came to this country, and even if we use the government's sanitised figures, that's net migration of over 700,000. But there you go. Let's take this figure as a starting point. 300,000 new homes each year. In October 2022, there were over 676,000 recorded empty homes in England. Just England. That's a lot of empty properties. In 1988, small developers were responsible for 4 in every 10 new build homes, compared to just 12% today. 30 years ago, there were about 12,500 small developers generating under 100 homes a year each. Today, there are only 2,500, 1/5. More than 1.1 million homes granted planning permission in England in the last decade are yet to be built on. So what's going on here? I'll tell you what is going on here. First of all, the government has done nothing to encourage the renovation of these empty properties to bring them back into use. Many of these properties will be derelict, in need of refurbishment, or they may have fallen below the minimum EPC required to rent them out. And these properties are not going to be brought back into use by the major developers. They are not interested in the messing around required to renovate individual properties, 2 up, 2 downs, especially further north where the value of these properties is significantly less. But the British public, they are the ones who can and should be renovating these properties. The British public love property, but in their wisdom, what have this lot done to encourage this? The Chancellor last year announced that he would be slashing the capital gains tax allowance, halving it last year, halving it this year again, basically down to next to nothing. What incentive has he offered the British public to go out and renovate these properties? On top of the 3% surcharge that George Osborne added onto second properties back in 2016, which basically took yet more of the already small margin out of renovating these properties. I believe that the Chancellor should have done the opposite. He should have actually increased the capital gains tax allowance for renovating these properties, but it could have been subject to certain conditions. For example, that the property has been emptied for a set period, that it is renovated to a set standard, to a minimum energy performance level. Offer an incentive to people like you and I, and have an army of people out there who can not only make a small profit, but they can bring these properties back into use. And whether they are sold on or rented on, it doesn't really matter. They are homes available for the people. And yes, many of these homes may well be in the wrong places, because in total, we do have almost enough property to go around. It's just that so many properties are in the wrong places. But what does it mean a property is in the wrong place? It means there are a lot of empty properties in places where there are no jobs. Why are there no jobs in these places? Because the government does not offer enough incentives for businesses to move there at a time when business can be conducted remotely, increasingly so. There is absolutely no reason for any part of the country to have a problem with vacancies for people, one way or another. Encourage businesses to move in. They bring jobs, they bring people, they bring prosperity, and that is what you will call genuine levelling up. But they don't. But on top of this, what we are seeing is that the large developers, and there's only a handful of them really, I won't mention that 8 of them are actually being investigated for exchanging information, basically price fixing, but that's another matter. On top of that, what they are doing is they are stockpiling development land. They buy land with permission and stockpile it to prevent smaller developers or other developers getting hold of it, but they don't build on it all. They build on less than half of it so that they can control the market, so that they can control availability, so that they can drip feed their overpriced, undersized property to you, the British public, as and when it suits them. And as I've said before, if these people were dealing in stocks and shares, they would be in jail. At least twice as much land is provided every year for housing than homes started. Exactly. Developers are building or developing less than half of the land that is available, and we wonder why there's a housing crisis. More than 30% of homes with planning permission are never built at all, and in London it's around double that. Planning permission granted, developers hold on to it and never build on it, and often they buy it just to stop others buying it. Supermarkets are also guilty of this, buying land to stop another supermarket from building and doing nothing with it. This must be stopped. So what can be done? Firstly, capital tax incentives for private renovations. Let's mobilise the British public. Let's give them an incentive, a financial benefit for once. How about the government does something that will encourage people to do something because it will benefit them financially? Increase the capital gains tax allowance on bringing these properties back into use. Let's make an economy and a housing structure that is defined by people improving properties and making them available, rather than greedy corporates clinging onto something like Scrooge clinging onto his gold coins. Incentives for improving EPC ratings. We have some of the oldest and most beautiful housing stock in the world. But conversely, that means that much of our housing stock is very poorly insulated. And therefore, does it not make sense for the government to have ongoing incentives to improve the energy efficiency of properties? But this should not be done with threats and with coercion. It should be done with incentives, because if we accept that much of our housing stock is much older than we are and was here long before us, all being well, it will still be here long after we're gone. Therefore, we're effectively passing through. I would put it to you that a sensible government would have an ongoing policy of encouraging our housing stock, a national asset, to be improved continually. Affordable housing investment tax breaks. What's that? There are so many people with money to invest in this country. Exiting landlords, businessmen, overseas investors. How about tax incentives encouraging these people to pull their money together and buy some of this land that is being stockpiled by the greedy developers and building affordable housing? Because when properties are built in their hundreds, the unit cost is far, far lower than when you build half a dozen or so. It's a completely different thing. The margins, the cost per unit is completely different. But that cost per unit could be passed on to first-time buyers in the name of affordable housing. It could be rented out at a reasonable figure. The investors would still make a great return with a good yield on their investment, and perhaps the tenants could have an option to buy after 5 years at a discount so that they could actually afford to buy the property. The investor would make a return with a tax incentive, and then they could plough their money into yet another development project. What would have happened here? Affordable housing appearing throughout the country, and it wouldn't cost the government a single penny. On the contrary, if we take into account the multiplier factor that all of this building and associated spending on kitchens, bathrooms, furniture, etc., it would generate more tax revenue for the government, but they still don't do it. Is it because their allegiances are with the large developers, or is there some other reason? I don't know, but this makes perfect sense to me. Accelerated urban regeneration. There is capacity for millions of homes in brownfield inner city sites, but more often than not, the major developers are not interested because invariably brownfield sites involve more messing around. Sometimes it could be being sympathetic to properties in the surrounding area. It could be cleaning up the land before they develop it. Any number of reasons. The developers prefer to just build on a flat, even field or playing field and throw up their carbon copy Legoland houses, move in, sell them on and move out, rather than inner cities. And yet it is regenerating inner cities that not only make sense financially, but they make sense logistically, because in an age when we are trying to reduce emissions, traffic, reliance on the car, which makes perfect sense, but don't reduce reliance on cars by punishing people. Reduce reliance on cars by creating lifestyles that has less need for it. How about far more mixed use developments in inner cities, retail downstairs, offices on the first floor, residential further up? How about a restriction on hypermarkets that have drowned out all of the smaller shops, so that we begin to see more smaller shops in these neighbourhoods, from greengrocers to butchers to so on and so forth, where people can actually walk downstairs and walk to the shop? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But no, instead they build new developments further and further and further out. And as you know, these developments are even continually increasingly more stressful to live in, because they've turned the roads into alleyways, the garages into sheds, and they've turned living space into barely minimal space. And on these estates, if you're lucky, there might be 1 or 2 shops. How are people supposed to live there without being totally dependent on their car? Something that you are punishing them for. Doesn't really make sense, does it? So, what else? Penalties to prevent land banking. Major developers must not be permitted to simply buy development land and hold on to it, and legislation can see to this. For example, enforced completion timescales. For anybody who's ever got planning permission, you may be aware that it is normally time limited. It's normally around 3 years. So from the minute the planning permission is granted, you have 3 years to start the project, not finish it, to start it. What does starting a project mean? Well, it could be as little as digging a hole for the footings, and then you can just leave it. No, no, no. How about on these major developments that it is time limited? From the minute permission is granted, if that developer wants that land, has applied for planning, then in 3 years they must complete the project, or they will be penalised, or they will be forced to sell it. But one way or another, the building on that land must happen, and if that developer is not prepared to do it, then that developer must make it available to others who will. Simplified land partitioning, where there is land that has been granted planning permission, albeit outline planning permission. For example, if a consortium of small developers want to buy that land and partition it into however many parcels so they can build 5 or 10 properties each, they should not be unreasonably obstructed, so that we can support the small developers, because it is the small developers who more often than not build higher quality, more character property in small little closes that appeal much more than the carbon copy Legoland we get from the major developers. And of course, hand in hand with that, support for independent developers so that we can make it easier for them to compete. We have a burden of responsibility to ensure that young people have access to their own home, raise their own family, and to build their own lives. I believe this passionately, and this is what I believe. I'm not speaking on behalf of the party, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else, and everything I've said in this video is what I believe and what I will passionately be pushing for. And in fact, I have been ranting about this on my property channel for a long time. And this is really important, because people cannot build a life if they cannot have a home. People need their home to be able to build a life, and that's really important, because at a time of a national crisis, I believe, let's encourage procreation, not immigration. Let's help young people to get a home, build a life, have a family, and stop importing all and sundry from the 4 corners of the world. It's time for reform. That's all for now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, and I'll see you.